The following program presents the month of April 1861 from a Grand Theater perspective. April 1st, 1861. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln has nearly completed his first month in office. Before Lincoln's term had begun, 7 cotton states from Texas to South Carolina had seceded during Buchanan's administration. Lincoln, however, is resolute that United States properties, including besieged Fort Sumter off Charleston, South Carolina, and Fort Pickens off Pensacola, Florida, will be defended if attacked. The Lincoln administration has also declared that it does not recognize the Confederate government headquartered in Montgomery, Alabama, as a legitimate government. In Washington, congressmen are still working to find a solution to the crisis. There is hope that upper South states, like Virginia and Tennessee, will remain in the Union. On April 1st, in Richmond, Virginia, convention members debate secession. Convention presenters state that the counties of Albemarle, Bedford, Amelia, and Madison favor secession. A petition in Norfolk, Virginia, calls for secession. On April 3rd, at Charleston, South Carolina, the schooner Rhoda H. Shannon, which was shipping ice to Savannah, is fired on by rebel batteries because it flew the United States flag. April 4th, rumors are appearing in newspapers that Fort Sumter in Charleston is to be attacked within a few days. We will zoom into Fort Sumter. Major Anderson's United States garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor is surrounded by rebel cannons and fortifications. More rumors claim Charleston has cut off Fort Sumter's supplies, and others claim the fort is nearly out of supply. These sentiments have been voiced for months. It's estimated that some 5,000 Southern militia are ready to assist an attack on Fort Sumter. April 7th, General Beauregard, commanding the Southern forces at Charleston, sent a messenger to Major Anderson at Fort Sumter. The message states, "In consequence of the delays and apparent vacillations of the United States government at Washington relative to the evacuation of Fort Sumter, no further communications for the purpose of supply with this city from the fort and with the fort from this city will be permitted." We will zoom back out. By this time, reports appear that Southern militia are drilling in large numbers in preparation to seize Fort Pickens off Pensacola. April 8th. In Detroit, Michigan, large numbers of fugitive slaves cross over into Canada. Large numbers of runaway slaves are moving through the Underground Railroad from the south into Illinois. From Chicago, they follow the Underground Railroad to Detroit and then on to Canada. Also on April 8th, in Washington, President Lincoln wires Governor Pickens of South Carolina, informing him that he was going to send supply and relief to Fort Sumter. On April 10th, ships at New York City steam toward Fort Sumter. They carry supplies for Fort Sumter's garrison. The United States shows it is going to support Fort Sumter, not abandon it. Also on April 10th, the Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama, wires Beauregard at Charleston, ordering him to deliver an ultimatum to Anderson at Fort Sumter. We will zoom into Charleston. April 11th, General Beauregard sends his aides to Major Anderson's garrison at Fort Sumter. Beauregard's message states, "I am ordered by the government of the Confederate States to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter." At the fort, Major Anderson sends an answer back to General Beauregard on that same day. Anderson states, "I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication demanding the evacuation of this fort, and to say, in reply thereto, that it is a demand with which I regret that my sense of honor and of my obligations to my government prevent my compliance." Night falls on April 11th. In the wee morning hours of April 12th, Beauregard's aides send another message to Major Anderson at Fort Sumter. The message reads, "Sir, by authority of Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the provisional forces of the Confederate States, we have the honor to notify you that he will open the fire of his batteries on Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time." Some 25 years before, Beauregard had studied artillery under Robert Anderson at West Point. Now in the early hours of April 12, 1861, Beauregard has his cannons pointed at his former teacher. The steamship Baltic, one of the relief ships from New York, has arrived off Charleston with supplies. Other ships from the relief effort have arrived as well. At 4:30 a.m., rebel cannons from Fort Johnson, Cummings Point, and Fort Moultrie opened fire. Fort Sumter is now under artillery fire. The defenders fire back. The Baltic attempts to carry supplies to Fort Sumter. However, the waters are rough and the ship does not have a gunboat available for cover. The ships cannot provide supply to the fort. Daylight. The cannons sound all through the day. The firing continues into the night. Morning, April 13th. The bombardment continues. Fort Sumter's crew eat the last of their rice rations. Fires are breaking out in the fort. By afternoon, after 34 hours of bombardment, Fort Sumter's magazine is surrounded by flames. The garrison has essentially run out of supply, and the supply ships cannot reach the fort. Major Anderson accepts Beauregard's evacuation terms. The bombardment ends, the fort will be evacuated. After the bombardment, the United States suffers its first fatality of the conflict. During the flag salute, a cannon explodes. One United States soldier is killed. The Union Army records its first death of the Civil War. Major Anderson's garrison prepares for evacuation. We will zoom out and then zoom into Fort Pickens off Pensacola, Florida. The United States garrison at Fort Pickens, much like Fort Sumter, is offshore and surrounded by mainland batteries. On April 13th, the United States ship Sabine arrives at Pensacola. Pensacola is now under blockade. Fort Pickens is reinforced. It is estimated that well over 5,000 rebels have amassed at Pensacola, but Fort Pickens is resolute to defend itself. We will zoom out and back into Charleston. April 14th. Anderson's United States garrison boards the ship Isabel, and after they leave the harbor, the garrison transfers to the steamer Baltic. The ship steams for New York City. Fort Sumter and all of Charleston Harbor is now entirely in the hands of the Confederacy. We will zoom out. The ramifications of the attack on Fort Sumter are immediate. The telegraph brings news of Fort Sumter across the continent on that day. April 14, 1861 is a Sunday. Across the South, church bells sound with jubilation. In the North, a new sense of duty to defend the country takes hold. The next day is Monday, April 15th, the first work day after the evacuation of Fort Sumter. In Washington, President Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The enlistments for these volunteers will be for 90 days. Among the slave states, Delaware and Maryland agree to provide volunteers for the United States. However, the other states in the Upper South reject Lincoln's call for volunteers. On April 16th, the United States ceases trade with states in secession. The next day, April 17th, in Richmond, Virginia, that state's convention votes to secede from the Union. Virginia's convention has adopted secession, but the people of Virginia will still need to vote on that secession. However, the Confederate government is already in motion to annex the state into the Confederacy before the popular vote. We will zoom in to the Chesapeake region. Virginia is the first state in the Upper South to secede from the Union. The Confederacy now has a large populous state on its side. As of April 17th, the Navy Yard at Norfolk, Virginia, and the United States Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, are in possession of the United States. However, these critical military stations are now in immediate danger of seizure. Ominously, many officers at the Norfolk Navy Yard resign their United States posts when secession is announced. The nation's capital is now just across the Potomac River from the Confederacy. Fears swirl that the capital itself is in danger. On April 18th, in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, the United States garrison there realizes that thousands of Virginia militia are approaching. In order to avoid the capture of the arsenal's weapons, The garrison sets the arsenal on fire. Thousands of weapons are destroyed. Nevertheless, Virginia's militia commandeer the critical junction at Harper's Ferry. It should be noted that Harper's Ferry, now in possession of the Confederates, is farther north than the capital, Washington. Also on April 18th, Pennsylvania units arrive in Washington to protect the city. Meanwhile, near Norfolk, General Taliaferro has Virginia militia prepared to capture the naval yard, which contains ships and thousands of cannons. On April 19th, in Washington, Abraham Lincoln casts the die. Lincoln declares that the United States will blockade southern ports. Fears continue that the capital is unprepared for seizure by rebel forces. The small garrison there is not prepared to hold off a large militia force. Pennsylvania volunteers had just arrived in Washington, and more volunteers were on the way. The 6th Massachusetts is en route by rail from Philadelphia for the capital. On April 19th, the troop train makes its stop in Baltimore, Maryland. The troops disembark to move to the next depot for the train to Washington. Stones and bricks are thrown at the soldiers. The soldiers fire back at the mob. A riot ensues. 4 Union soldiers are killed, and some 30 are wounded. The pro-Confederate mob reports several killed. Thus in Baltimore, the Union Army reports its first 4 killed in action. 12 citizens are killed in these Baltimore riots. That same evening, pro-Confederate mobs cut Baltimore's telegraph wires and destroy the northbound rail lines. Troops will not be able to enter Baltimore by train from the north. Telegraph wires to Washington are cut, and the Capitol, the President, the Congress, and General Winfield Scott are without long-distance communication. The next day, April 20th, at Norfolk, Virginia, the United States scuttles its ships there and attempts to destroy as many arms as possible before the rebel forces can secure the Navy Yard. One of the Navy ships scuttled is the Merrimack. The Navy Yard is abandoned. Norfolk is now occupied by Virginia militia. Also on April 20th, Robert E. Lee resigns from the United States Army. Lee will join Virginia in secession. We will zoom out. In Cleveland, Ohio on April 20th, Western Union Telegraph Superintendent Anson Stager issues this order to his offices in the North. You will not transmit, receive, or deliver any orders for arms or munitions of war unless for the defense of the government of the United States, nor any messages in cipher unless you know it to be from parties loyal to the government of the United States. We will zoom into the capital region. Eyes now turn to Maryland. Should this state join the Confederacy, the capital will most surely be lost. Due to the destruction of railroad lines at Baltimore, Union troops now will go by water around Baltimore and land at Annapolis, Maryland. By April 21st, U.S. troops under Benjamin Butler are shipped from Havre de Grace, Maryland, and landing in Annapolis, Maryland. In Washington, due to the sabotage of telegraph lines, President Lincoln and General Winfield Scott are still unable to issue long-distance communications. While the capital remains without communication to much of the rest of the country, New York will rise to the occasion. We will zoom out. On April 21st, General John Wool, commander of the Eastern Department of the Army, leaves his headquarters at Troy, New York, for New York City. In New York City, Wool and General John Dix coordinate defense for northern states in the capital. From New York City, communications can be wired between northern states, supplies can be coordinated, and orders delivered. At this moment, while the capital is without telegraphic services, New York City is operating as a temporary headquarters of sorts. We will zoom back into the capital region. April 23rd. The state of Virginia places Robert E. Lee in command of Virginia's forces. Meanwhile, Benjamin Butler's Union regiments secure the rail line between Annapolis and the capital. Communications are being restored. Butler's Union regiments will now march out toward the Relay House near Baltimore, Maryland, a critical junction of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway. Butler is making progress on restoring the transportation and communication lines in the capital region. We will take a wider vantage point of the Chesapeake region. On April 24th, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens is in Richmond, Virginia. He is meeting with the Virginia Convention. His purpose is to annex Virginia into the Confederacy before the state's popular vote in May. On the next day, April 25th, in Richmond, the Virginia Convention ratifies the agreement with the Confederate government. Virginia is now annexed into the Confederacy, all before the vote for secession can come before the people of Virginia. The head of the Virginia Convention is John Tyler, who had been President of the United States only 16 years before. On April 26th, at Richmond, Virginia, Joseph E. Johnston is assigned command of Confederate forces. On April 27th, at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, Colonel Thomas Jackson is assigned command of Virginia's troops at Harper's Ferry. In the midst of the unraveling turmoil, the United States gets a break. On April 29th, Maryland rejects secession. The previous mob violence in Baltimore is not indicative of the state's attitude. Union men outnumber Confederates in Maryland. In addition, the number of Union forces now in the capital exceeds 10,000, with thousands more en route. Lincoln's call for volunteers has provided enough men to garrison the capital city. We will zoom out. At the end of April, open hostilities are now underway. 8 states are now in secession. The first battle has occurred at Fort Sumter, with additional skirmishing at Baltimore, Maryland. Virginia secedes. Maryland remains loyal. The naval station at Norfolk, Virginia is now in the hands of the Confederacy. The capital city is guarded by thousands of new Union volunteers, but the Confederacy is just across the Potomac River. General Wool has made New York City a communications headquarters, while the capital's communications are repaired. The United States has declared a naval blockade of the Cotton South. A war has begun.